The Southwest Coast. We have learned about the Arctic region. We have learned about the Northwest Coast. Now we are going to learn about another region, the Southwest Coast. Again, we are going to talk about the environment of the Southwest, and the Southwest has the same three things in the environment we're going to talk about. We will talk about the climate, the geography, and the natural resources. Let's start with the climate. The climate of the Southwest. The farther north an area is in North America, the colder the climate will be. This also means that the farther south an area is, the warmer the climate will be. The climate of the Southwest was much warmer than the Northwest. The warm weather lasted a long time and provided a very long growing season, which was good for growing crops. The climate of the Southwest was extremely hot in summer. In the winter, it could be cool, especially at night, but never as cold as in the Arctic. The climate in the Southwest was also very dry and desert-like. Very little rain fell, usually less than 10 inches a year. Because so few rain clouds came to the Southwest, it was almost always sunny, but most of all, it was dry. The geography of the Southwest. The Southwest was a desert because it was surrounded by mountains. Those mountains blocked the moist air coming from the ocean and left the Southwest very dry. Rain and snow fell in the mountains, which created a few rivers and streams, especially the Colorado River that traveled through the Southwest. Over millions of years, those rivers cut deep valleys with straight up and down walls through the stone. The valleys are called canyons. The Southwest had many canyons. Some of those canyons, such as the Grand Canyon and Bryce Canyon, are now national parks. The Southwest was a desert. The Southwest also had many plateaus, which were high areas that were flat on top. The natural resources of the Southwest Coast. Natural resources were limited in the desert of the Southwest. There were almost no trees, very few game animals except in the mountains, and few edible wild plants. There were many rocks, heavy clay soil in areas, and little water. The Hopi tribe. Thousands of years ago, people developed a culture that accommodated to the life in this harsh environment. The Southwest, like the Northwest Coast, had many different tribes, but unlike the Northwest Coast, not all the tribes had the same culture. The Hopi were part of the Pueblo culture. We are going to learn all about the Hopi. The Hopi had a problem. They needed to figure out how to get food, clothing, and shelter living in a harsh desert environment. This was an economic problem. Solution for food. The Hopi and the need for food. In the desert, there were few game animals to hunt and not many edible wild plants, so people chose to farm to solve the need for food. Native Americans and their ancestors have farmed in the Southwest for about 5,000 years. For farming to be a solution, the Hopi had to get water to the crops. Luckily, the land was fertile enough to grow crops if water were available, but with very little rainfall, only very small amounts of crops could be grown. Only along the riverbanks was there enough water for farming, so they needed to come up with a solution. They invented a solution. The Hopi solved the problem of how to get enough water to grow crops in the dry desert environment by inventing irrigation. Irrigation brings water to the crops from elsewhere through man-made ditches and canals. Irrigation systems are ditches and canals dug all the way from upstream on the river down to the fields, so the river water will flow to the fields. The water from irrigation allowed the Native Americans to water crops in a region where no rain fell. The main crops they grew were beans, corn, squash, and cotton. Besides growing crops, Native Americans in the Southwest also raised turkeys for food and for their feathers. The Hopi and the need for clothing. Like most other Native American tribes, the Hopi wore clothing made of deerskin. The Hopi would go to the mountains to hunt deer every so often to bring back animal hide. They also used some rabbit fur for clothing. Deerskin and rabbit furs kept the Hopi warm when the weather was cool. However, during warm weather, the Hopi had a problem. The problem was that fur and leather were too warm to wear most of the year in the hot desert climate of the Southwest. To solve this problem, the Hopi learned to grow cotton. The cotton they grew was spun and woven into cooler cotton cloth for themselves. The cotton clothing was made as much cooler to wear. That is what they wore in the summer. The solution for shelter. Remember that the Chinook used the abundant forests in their environment to build shelter, and the Inuit used abundant ice and snow for building their igloos. In the same way, the Hopi accommodated to their environment and used a very abundant material, rock, to build their shelter. The Hopi learned to build the walls of their homes out of the abundant rock that was around them. Very few trees grew in the desert. The nearest trees were in the mountains, 25 to 90 miles away, which could take several days of travel. Native Americans at that time had no horses or vehicles to help transport the logs. For this reason, the Hopi used logs only to support the roof. Sometimes they found a cave big enough to build their houses in. Then they didn't need any logs because they did not need to make a roof at all. Carrying heavy stone to build the walls of their shelters out of stone was extremely hard work. The Hopi realized that if they did away with the space between houses, the same wall could be used for two houses instead of one. The towns of this culture often had all the houses attached to each other, like a giant apartment building. These huge stone buildings were sometimes several stories high and had several hundred residents in them. An entire town of people could live in one single huge apartment-like building. These ancient single-building towns were seen by the Spanish who explored the area in the 1500s. The Spanish word for town, pueblo, is still the name used today to describe these ancient buildings. The term, the Pueblo culture, refers to all the Native American tribes of the Southwest that built and lived in these stone structures. Today, some of the Hopi and Sunni tribes still live in pueblos in the Southwest. The effect of Hopi solutions. The Hopi found solutions to their need for food, shelter, and clothing that allowed them to survive in a harsh environment. They were able to live on land that no one else thought was usable. Because no one wanted their land, the Hopi were left alone more than any other group of Native Americans. In fact, they are one of the few groups of Native Americans that continue to live in the same place they always did. The effect of the Hopi solution was that their culture has survived to this day. The Hopi were and still are highly skilled at making baskets out of grasses woven together. Because they were successful in finding food, clothing, and shelter, they had time to learn to make things like baskets and pottery out of their resources. Some tribes could weave baskets so tightly that they would hold water. In the Southwest, one natural resource is clay, so in some places the soil is a heavy clay which can be made into pottery. The Hopi also became quite skilled at making and decorating pottery. Even today, the Native Americans of the Southwest are known for their beautiful pottery.